Maybe you're lying in bed tonight, phone screen dimmed, eyes half closed against the weight of another long day. Maybe you're simply searching for a quiet companion in the dark, a story that moves slowly enough for your thoughts to drift beside it. So, let's take a small step backward in time. Not to the roar of battle or the glare of propaganda films, but to something quieter, a flicker beneath the surface. Picture a candle burning in a stone room. Its light trembles against the wall, shaping strange shadows, the kind that seem almost alive when you're tired enough to believe they might be. Around the candle, a circle of men lean forward. They wear uniforms that haven't yet become infamous, coats stitched with runes and eagles. On the table between them lie objects that do not belong together, a compass, a skull, a silver chalice, a map of stars. This is Germany in the 1930s, a place caught between science and sorcery. A land rebuilding itself through factories and formulas, yet whispering to ancient gods in the dark corners of its heart. Outside, radios hum with talk of recovery and destiny. Inside, beneath vaulted ceilings, people speak of Atlantis, of lost races, of secret powers buried under mountains and ice. The language of microscopes and measurements mixes strangely with the language of prophecy. It would be comforting to think that such contradictions could not live side by side, that reason would always drive out myth. But history teaches us otherwise. Again and again, whenever the world trembles, human beings reach for something older than logic, a promise that hidden forces might restore what has been broken. The candle in that stone room burns lower. Its smoke curls upward like a question: what if power itself could be summoned, not built? What if the future could be shaped by symbols, not machines? Tonight, we'll walk through that smoke together, through the world of men who believed such questions had answers. They built laboratories like temples, and temples like laboratories. They called on the past to forge their future, mixing superstition with science until neither could be told apart. Our story drifts there, into the uneasy glow between faith and reason, where the dream of control becomes the seed of ruin. Let the modern world fade from your room for a while. Close your eyes. Listen for the echo of marching boots dissolving into the rustle of parchment and candle flame. Because somewhere in those echoes, long before the first shot of the war was fired, an empire was already conjuring itself, not out of steel and oil, but out of myth. The year is 1918. The guns have fallen silent, but peace does not feel like peace. Germany lies hollowed out, a body breathing but without spirit. Factories stand half-ruined, rail lines twist through bomb-scarred towns. In the markets, paper money flutters like autumn leaves, its value shrinking by the hour. Mothers trade wedding rings for bread. Men stand in long lines that lead nowhere, their uniforms stripped of honor, their eyes of light. The old world has died, and no one quite knows what to do with the corpse. In that emptiness, the night becomes heavier. And in the silence that follows great loss, strange voices begin to sound, not from heaven, but from cellars, taverns, and candlelit rooms. There, people gather around maps of vanished continents. They whisper of a northern paradise called Thule, a place said to have birthed a pure and noble race before history began. To them, these myths are not bedtime stories but lifelines, proof that somewhere behind the humiliation of defeat lies a hidden destiny waiting to be awakened. The Thule Society, born in Munich in the chill of 1918, becomes a meeting ground for dreamers and the disillusioned. Their rituals are not grand, no thunder, no miracles, only incense, dim lamps, the scratch of quills upon parchment. A scholar reads from ancient Greek texts while a soldier traces runes onto the wooden table. Somewhere, a violin plays a mournful tune that sounds both medieval and modern. The air thickens with smoke, tobacco, and belief. Outside, hunger riots flicker through the streets. Inside, these gatherings promise meaning in an age when meaning seems extinct. Members speak of hidden energies, of ancestral memory, of cosmic orders that will one day restore balance to a broken world. They study astrology, race theory, mysticism, each word a spark in the darkness. And in that dim circle of warmth, one can almost understand their longing. For people who have lost everything, empire, faith, dignity, even the impossible begins to feel reasonable. When the stars seem indifferent, prophecy feels like company. When governments crumble, symbols offer shelter. Among them move names that history will later remember: Rudolf Hess, Dietrich Eckart, men who will carry these half-dreamed ideas into new rooms, with new listeners. But for now, in 1919, it is still small, still secret, a fragile constellation of loneliness and hope flickering against the wider darkness. The Thule Society's members believe they are rescuing their nation's soul. What they cannot see is that they are also planting the seeds of a delusion, one that will grow roots through science, through politics, and eventually through the heart of power itself. Outside, dawn seeps through the city's fog. The last candle in the meeting hall sputters and dies. But the smoke it leaves behind, pale, twisting, and fragrant with incense, lingers. It drifts upward into the cold air, carrying with it a single question that will haunt a generation. Can myth rebuild what truth has broken? Symbols are strange things. They begin as whispers, small, harmless shapes drawn in the dust by hands that mean no harm. They belong to the ancient and the innocent. The potter marking his clay, the monk sketching harmony in the margin of a manuscript, the child tracing sunlight on the ground. For thousands of years, one such symbol, a cross bent at its arms, danced across temples and prayer scrolls from India to Greece. It was the swastika, an emblem of movement, of continuity, of the sun's eternal return. Its name came from Sanskrit, svastika, meaning, to be well, to be fortunate. In Buddhist shrines, it marked the footsteps of enlightenment. In Hindu temples, it guarded doorways against misfortune. Even in early European art, it shimmered as a quiet sign of life and balance. But time has a way of changing the hands that hold such symbols. By the 1920s, in the dim rooms of Munich where the Thule Society had taken root, that ancient mark was lifted from its past and turned slowly toward a darker horizon. The curved arms that once spun with the rhythm of the cosmos were redrawn with sharp lines, rigid, black, and angled like blades. Placed upon a white circle and a field of blood red, the sign that once meant blessing became a banner of destiny. It is difficult, even now, to look at it and imagine what it once stood for. But in those early years, the change felt powerful, intoxicating even. In a world fractured by defeat, here was an image that promised motion again, a symbol that turned, always turning, always forward. The people who saw it on pamphlets and banners spoke of energy, unity, rebirth. Few noticed how that rotation drew them inward, into orbit around a man whose own beliefs were still forming in the shadows. Adolf Hitler, in those years before power, was no magician. He mocked fortune-tellers, sneered at seances, and dismissed superstition as weakness. Yet even he could not ignore the quiet electricity of symbols, how they could stir the emotions faster than any speech. He understood that the heart responds to what the mind cannot name. A color, a sound, a simple shape could become a key, unlocking fears, memories, and longings buried deep in the collective soul. So the swastika was chosen. Not for its history, but for its effect. It was both ancient and new, both sacred and aggressive, a bridge between the mystical and the modern. And beneath its arms, millions would one day march, believing they were part of something eternal. In that moment, belief became theater. The banners unfurled not just on flagpoles, but inside minds. Every rally, every salute, every echoing chant was a carefully written scene, a performance meant to make the audience forget it was a play. The ancient symbol that once turned with the sun now turned upon itself, endlessly, hungrily, consuming the very light it claimed to represent. Its rhythm hypnotized, its geometry seduced, and its meaning, once pure, was rewritten in fire and fear. Pause, faint sound of fabric folding, candle hiss. Symbols are strange things. They can be born from prayer and die in propaganda. They can lead us to beauty, or blind us with it. And as that black emblem began to spread across Germany's walls, its new purpose was clear, not to enlighten, but to command. The swastika would no longer bless the world. It would brand it. Power has many faces. Some rule through charisma, a raised voice, a fist, a roar that shakes the crowd. Others rule through silence. Through structure. Through ritual. Heinrich Himmler was a quiet man. His spectacles fogged easily, his voice rarely rose. He was no warrior, no fiery orator. But behind that mild exterior was an obsession, the belief that destiny could be organized, purified, and preserved like an ancient relic placed behind glass. Himmler saw himself not merely as a soldier but as a priest, the high servant of a new, cold religion. Its God was race, its scripture was blood, and its heaven lay somewhere in the distant past. He studied ancient runes and medieval chronicles late into the night, surrounded by candlelight and dust. He spoke of karma, reincarnation, and cosmic cycles as though the Third Reich itself were a returning empire from another age. Sometimes he told close confidants that he had once lived as a Germanic king. That he and his officers were reincarnations of knights who had sworn eternal loyalty centuries before. But this faith was not gentle. It was order without mercy, history without humility. The sound of boots echoes in the distance, slow, deliberate. In 1934, Himmler discovered a place that seemed to mirror the geometry of his own mind, a lonely Renaissance fortress rising from the hills of Westphalia. Wielsburg Castle. Its towers cut into the mist like the tips of ancient spears. Its corridors were narrow, its rooms cold, the air tasting faintly of iron and old limestone. He walked through its halls and declared that this would become the spiritual heart of the SS. Not a headquarters, not a military base, but something stranger, a monastery for modern knights. He spoke the words calmly, as if announcing a schedule. But what he envisioned was nothing less than a new faith, one that would bind his officers through ceremony, secrecy, and the illusion of divine purpose. Soon, the work began. Architects were summoned. Plans redrawn. Walls were measured not just in meters, but in symbols. Every stone, every chamber, every window was chosen to reflect ancient numbers, runic geometry, astrological alignments. Himmler's vision grew layer by layer, like a ritual unfolding in brick and mortar. Soundscape, chisels striking stone, a low chant under breath. The castle was to be the center of the world, he said, the axis around which his new order would turn. Within its walls, he would train a brotherhood unlike any before, men who believed themselves chosen by fate, cleansed of doubt, reborn through ritual. The SS, Schutzstaffel, became his instrument of faith. Uniforms replaced robes, insignias replaced sacraments. Oaths of loyalty were spoken not before God, but before Himmler himself, as if he were high priest and prophet combined. He redesigned their insignia with almost monastic precision. The twin lightning runes, Sig runes, were taken from ancient alphabets, symbols of victory and sun fire. To outsiders, they were letters. To Himmler, they were invocations, strokes of power, etched into the very identity of his order. In his mind, the SS was not merely a security force, it was a sacred order tasked with reshaping the world. Each member a knight of the new dawn, bound by blood, ritual, and belief. The faint echo of Gregorian-like chanting begins, male voices, low, rhythmic. But in the silence between those chants, the darkness of his theology reveals itself. Purity demanded exclusion. Faith demanded cruelty. The same symbols that once stood for sunlight and victory now became sigils of death. Himmler believed that through these rituals, through the castle, the symbols, the ceremonies, he could summon not spirits, but certainty. And certainty, once weaponized, becomes the coldest form of power. The dripping of water in Wielsburg's crypts echoed like a metronome for his dreams. He moved through its halls as if walking through history, not the one that existed, but the one he was determined to rewrite. Footsteps fade slowly. Wind rises in the corridors. In this castle of stone, Himmler fused religion with bureaucracy, mysticism with murder. A church built not for worship, but for control. And in its heart, beneath carved ceilings and runic flags, he began shaping the rituals that would soon define the SS as the priesthood of a thousand-year nightmare. Pause. One faint candle extinguishes. But what was built to last forever would soon become a tomb. Beneath the great hall of Wilsberg Castle lies a room that does not appear on any tourist map. You have to descend a spiral staircase, carved centuries ago, the walls cool and sweating with age. Each step echoes back on itself, a rhythm of descent, one that feels less like walking and more like falling through time. At the bottom, you reach the crypt. It is small, circular, and silent. The air smells of iron, candle wax, and old earth. Here, Heinrich Himmler built what he called the spiritual heart of his new order. At the center of the floor lies a strange mosaic, 12 dark rays spinning outward in a perfect circle. It is not ancient, though it pretends to be. Himmler called it the Black Sun. A symbol without history, invented to look eternal. The 12 arms radiate like spokes of destiny, each pointing to a marble pedestal. And upon those pedestals, 12 chairs once stood, each carved of heavy oak, each marked with a rune. They were meant for Himmler's chosen knights, his 12 apostles of racial faith. Around their table, he imagined the rebirth of an empire, a round table for a dark age. A soft chorus begins, deep male voices murmuring in Latin and German, echoing faintly. When night fell, the torches would be lit. Their flames danced against the walls, and the shadows of those 12 chairs stretched like giants. The smoke would gather beneath the vaulted ceiling, curling upward as though drawn toward the unseen sun beneath their feet. Some said Himmler would stand at the center of the room, palms open, whispering words from runic scripts. Others said he simply watched, silent, entranced, as his officers performed ceremonies of allegiance. Each vow, each candle, each step aligned to celestial patterns. Everything, the angle of the torches, the direction of the chairs, the timing of the chants, followed his astrological calculations. He believed that in the ancient world, geometry was not mathematics, but prayer. Circles called to the cosmos. Lines spoke to the divine. By replicating those patterns in stone, he imagined he could resurrect forgotten forces, that the geometry itself might remember him. Faint sound of chalk scratching across stone, as if someone draws symbols unseen. It was obsession disguised as order, madness hidden inside mathematics. Each star chart pinned to his office wall, each rune inked into parchment, every fraction of light measured and recorded. He called it heritage, ancestry, destiny. But it was really hunger, the longing of a man desperate to give meaning to power. Those who served under him learned the choreography of devotion. New SS initiates were brought to Wilsberg and made to descend the same staircase, one by one. In the crypt, beneath the glow of the torches, they pledged their bloodline to eternity. They were told they were part of something greater, that their lives were mere continuations of a story begun in prehistory. Himmler spoke to them of cycles, of souls returning, of races reborn. He told them that the black sun represented the hidden heart of the world, the unseen source of strength that had always guided the Germanic peoples. It was myth as machinery, a perfect circle of belief engineered to keep itself turning. The chanting grows louder, Latin phrases overlapping with Germanic runes, until indistinguishable. For Himmler, this was not theater. It was revelation. He believed that power was not only political, but cosmic, that to rule the world, one must first claim the invisible. And so, he built his empire's soul from stone and shadow, convinced that the future could be summoned like a spirit if only the ritual were precise enough. But there, in the heart of the castle, surrounded by symbols that pointed inward instead of upward, the sacred turned inward too. Light became darkness. Faith became obsession. And the circle that promised perfection became a trap with no exit. The chanting fades. Only a faint hum remains, a sound like the wind circling itself. If you listen closely, even now, visitors say you can hear it. The whisper of footsteps. The scrape of a chair. The murmur of vows spoken to a sun that never rose. For those who once knelt here, the black sun was not just a symbol. It was a mirror, one that reflected their devotion until it devoured them whole. Long pause. Then, a faint echo, as though the wind itself exhales through the stone hull. And above this chamber of shadows, the machinery of war continued to turn, unaware that deep beneath its feet, its architect was praying to geometry. From the black stones of Wheelsburg, our story drifts east, over forests and plains, over the deserts of Central Asia, until the land begins to rise. Mountains lift like frozen waves, white and immense, their peaks vanishing into pale clouds. The year is 1938, and beneath these ancient skies moves a small procession of men, German uniforms wrapped in furs, cameras slung around their necks, notebooks trembling in gloved hands. They are explorers, scientists, and soldiers, members of the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Office of the SS. Their leader is Ernst Schaefer, a zoologist, a hunter, and a man drawn as much to the myth of purity as to the call of adventure. Their destination is Tibet, the roof of the world. To Himmler, it is more than a land. It is a riddle. He believes that hidden among these peaks lies the origin of the so-called Aryan race, the spiritual cradle of the Reich. And so, with measuring tapes, calipers, cameras, and maps, these men are sent to find proof, a scientific pilgrimage in search of myth. The faint sound of a yak bell, wind whistles through prayer flags. The expedition moves slowly along narrow passes. Snow drifts across the trails like spilled flour. The men grow quiet in the altitude, each breath a reminder that they are visitors in a realm untouched by their empire's noise. Above them, the prayer flags snap in the wind, red, blue, yellow, each one carrying a written blessing. For the locals, these words are gifts to the sky. For the Germans, they are data, symbols to decode. At night, under the tense flickering lamplight, Schaefer's team unrolls maps and star charts. They take measurements of skulls from villagers, tracing angles, cataloging noses and foreheads as though the divine could be found through bone. They collect animal skins, fossils, fragments of pottery, but beneath the surface of their research lies a deeper hunger, to confirm a story already written for them back in Berlin. In temples glowing with butter lamps, they meet monks whose calm eyes seem to see through the visitor's feverish intent. The explorers bow awkwardly, uncertain whether to treat these rituals as religion or specimen. They listen to chants that echo for hours, the air thick with incense and the smell of juniper smoke. Somewhere between reverence and arrogance, they begin to feel the strange pull of the place, as though the mountains themselves are watching. Faint sound of low chanting, rhythmic as a heartbeat. Schaefer writes in his Journal of Beauty, of sunlight breaking over glaciers, of monasteries clinging to cliffs like swallows' nests, of gold statues whose faces seem alive. But he also writes of frustration. No relic, no measurement, no skull seems to reveal the hidden link his superiors crave. The more he looks, the less he sees. The mountain wind carries away his conclusions like dust. For all their instruments, these men are still pilgrims, not scientists, but seekers of confirmation. They gaze at sacred murals and see only ancestry charts. They hear mantras and translate them into hierarchies. Their wonder, genuine at first, begins to sour, curdled by the quiet voice of ideology whispering that beauty must always serve proof. Wind rises, faint flapping of the prayer flags, breath quickens. In the high valleys of Tibet, the expedition finds no evidence of an Aryan homeland, only silence and sky. Yet when they return home, their reports are written as triumphs. Photographs are labeled scientific discoveries. Specimens are displayed as trophies of destiny. And the myth, that the roots of the Reich reach to the very roof of the world, becomes one more stone in Himmler's growing temple of illusion. But somewhere deep in Schaefer's memory, perhaps, the mountains linger. Not as proof, but as a question that refused to vanish. How could one seek the heavens with eyes already decided on what they would see? Soft pause. The sound of prayer flags fades into the whisper of wind, blending slowly with silence. Long before the tanks, before the speeches, before the world began to tremble beneath his voice, there was a silence. A silence inside a museum in Vienna. And a young man, pale, hungry, with eyes that stared longer than they should. It was sometime in the early years of the century, before the First War, before the name Hitler meant anything at all. He wandered the halls of the Hofburg Museum, drawn not by art or empire, but by something older, something that gleamed behind a pane of glass. There, on a velvet cushion, rested a long iron lance, darkened with age, its surface cracked and rough. Some said it was the spear that pierced the side of Christ upon the cross. Others claimed it had passed through the hands of emperors, Constantine, Charlemagne, Frederick Barbarossa, each drawing power from the same point of metal. To touch it, legend said, was to hold destiny itself. But to lose it, was to lose one's rule. Soft, distant choir tones, low and echoing. The young man stood there for a long time. Later, he would tell companions that something passed through him in that moment, that he felt his fate entwine with the relics. Whether it was true or not hardly matters now, the story became part of him, a private mythology that would one day be stitched into a nation's madness. Years passed. Empires rose and fell. And when that same man returned as Führer, he carried not just ambition, but that silent memory, the idea that history could be possessed, that destiny could be held like an object. In 1938, when Austria was annexed into the Reich, the relic was among the treasures seized. The Holy Lance was removed from Vienna and carried in guarded trucks to Nuremberg, the city Hitler called the spiritual heart of his empire. It arrived under banners and torchlight, escorted by soldiers who barely understood what they carried. But to Hitler, it was not ceremony, it was completion. In that transfer, myth had come full circle. The spear of emperors now rested in the hands of a man who believed himself chosen to restore their empire. Faint echo of marching steps, then the tone softens again. Yet history, like faith, is rarely so obedient. The lance itself, the real one, was almost certainly a medieval relic, its true origin uncertain, its holiness unprovable. It had no divine spark, no magic edge. But the belief was enough. For those who saw the world through symbols, it became more than metal. It became permission. And in that permission, the idea that power could be sanctified, something deeply human stirred. That yearning to be part of a story larger than the self, to touch eternity even for a moment. The faint sound of metal clinking, the museum guard's key turning a lock. In quiet moments, even the most ruthless dreamers are lonely. Perhaps that was Hitler's curse. To feel that the world itself was hollow unless filled with symbols. To believe that victory could be secured not through compassion or courage, but through possession of relics, objects that whispered of divine favor. He surrounded himself with them. Spears, banners, bloodlines, borrowed glories. As though layering armor against the fear that he, too, was only mortal. The spear of destiny became both relic and mirror. It reflected not holiness, but hunger, the desperate human need to believe that meaning can be touched. Soft choral music fades, replaced by the quiet hum of wind through stone corridors. When the Allies entered Nuremberg years later, they found the relic buried beneath rubble, tarnished, untouched, utterly ordinary. But to the man who had once stood before it as a boy, it had already served its purpose. For belief, once lit, no longer needs the candle that began it. Long pause. Then, a soft whisper. And somewhere, deep within the myth he built. A man who mistook symbols for destiny mistook his reflection for eternity. Silence, the faint echo of bells, far away. If Wheelsburg Castle was the altar of the Reich's new religion, then the Annenerbe Institute was its scripture. Founded in 1935 under Himmler's careful watch, its name meant ancestral heritage. To the world, it appeared to be a scholarly organization, a place where history, archaeology, and anthropology met to uncover the forgotten roots of civilization. But beneath its polished title lay a purpose far older than science, and far darker. Inside its offices, the air smelled of dust, ink, and conviction. Professors, linguists, and archaeologists sat at long oak tables surrounded by books and skulls. On the walls hung maps not of nations, but of legends: Atlantis, Hyperborea, Aryan migration routes traced like veins through time. Their task was not to discover truth, it was to confirm a prophecy. To find proof that the Reich's mythology was, in fact, history. Soft sound of brush on stone, gentle strokes, as if cleaning an artifact. Field teams were dispatched across Europe, to caves in France, mountains in Italy, and burial mounds across Scandinavia. Men with degrees in archaeology carried torches through prehistoric tunnels, brushing dust from bones that would be catalogued not for what they were, but for what they could be made to represent. Measurements were taken: the curve of a skull, the length of a femur, the angle of an eye socket, all plotted on charts that bent toward a conclusion already written before the expedition began. In laboratories back in Berlin, glass jars lined the shelves, filled with samples and dreams. Researchers traced ancient runes by candlelight, their minds caught between language and incantation. Every discovery became a sermon. Every artifact, a sermon note for the myth of racial destiny. Sound, quiet dripping, faint shuffle of papers. To walk through the Ahnenerbs halls was to hear the soft rustle of reasoning turned inside out. A kind of calm madness filled the place, one that spoke in academic tones, footnotes, and diagrams, yet served a creed rather than a cause. They were not villains in their own eyes, they were custodians of truth, rescuing it from what they called corruption. And that is the most dangerous illusion of all. When intellect begins to believe it serves enlightenment while feeding the dark. The Institute even created its own museums, rooms filled with relics that whispered of a glorious prehistoric Germany. Visitors were shown skulls said to prove Aryan lineage, runestones interpreted to predict the Reich's rise. The exhibits gleamed beneath lamps and glass, each piece polished, labeled, and false. Knowledge had been refashioned into devotion. Faint murmur of typewriters, rhythmic and steady. Outside those offices, the world was changing, tanks rolling, flags rising, yet inside, the scholars pressed on, tracing the past as if it could shield the present. They sent reports to Himmler thick with diagrams and conclusions that read like prayers. Evidence confirms divine origin of Nordic man. Archaeological alignment corresponds with ancient prophecy. Each line another brick in the architecture of delusion. And yet, somewhere, in the quiet between sentences, perhaps one or two among them paused. Perhaps a young assistant brushing soil from a skull wondered what it meant, this endless search for purity in bones. Perhaps a translator of runes noticed that belief, once wrapped in scientific language, becomes harder to challenge, harder to see for what it is. Soft sigh of wind through an open window. The tone turns tender, reflective. There is tragedy in that silence, not of monsters, but of minds that wished to serve truth and ended up serving power. The light of intellect, bent just slightly, became a mirror for myth. And the deeper they looked into that mirror, the more it reflected only themselves, their fears, their hunger for order, their wish that the chaos of history might one day make sense. In the end, the Ahnenerbe was less a school than a chapel. A place where knowledge bowed its head to faith. And where science, meant to illuminate, became the instrument of shadow. The ticking clock fades. The brush on stone stops. Silence. For even in the brightest rooms, it is possible to lose sight of what light is for. Soft exhale, scene fades into stillness. War, at its height, has its own strange silence. It is not the silence of peace, but of calculation, of minds bent over maps, pencils tracing lines that decide the lives of millions. In the war rooms of the Reich, beneath chandeliers and smoke, men in uniforms whisper over charts. Yet even here, amid radios, telegraphs, and the hum of modern machinery, the old ghosts have returned. For behind the measured voices and scientific planning, another kind of counsel whispers in the dark. Not from generals, but from astrologers. Not from logic, but from the stars. The soft shuffle of paper, a faint metallic rattle of compasses on maps. One of these voices belonged to Karl Ernst Kraft, a Swiss astrologer with narrow eyes and calm certainty. He had written to Hitler's staff years earlier, claiming that the stars themselves foretold the Führer's destiny, that the heavens aligned at his birth, marking him as chosen. At first, Hitler dismissed him. But as the war dragged on, and victories turned to stalemates, and stalemates to losses, the comfort of numbers began to lose its warmth. And so, the calculations of generals gave way to the calculations of constellations. Kraft was summoned to Berlin. He brought charts inked with strange symbols, Mars in opposition, Saturn in decline, Jupiter rising. He spoke softly, with the confidence of one who has made peace with uncertainty. To anxious men, that calm was seductive. He predicted air raids, political betrayals, turning tides. And when one prediction, the bombing of a German city, seemed to come true, the room's faith in him hardened. No longer an eccentric, he became a prophet of strategy. Ticking grows louder, steadier. A match is struck, papers shuffle. It is one of history's strangest contradictions, that an empire boasting the most advanced technology of its time also sought guidance from horoscopes and pendulums. While engineers built rockets to pierce the edge of the atmosphere, ministers consulted mediums to interpret the stars. In laboratories, the future was forged in metal. But in Hitler's circle, the past, that old, mystical past, still whispered louder than reason. Even the timing of invasions, the choice of dates, the speeches to the nation, all were sometimes aligned with cosmic readings. The belief was simple: if destiny had chosen them, then the universe itself must agree. Every victory became proof. Every defeat, a test of faith. The sound of a pen hesitates. The ticking clock pauses, then resumes, slower now. For Hitler, the world was not a map but a mirror. He believed that his will could bend fate, that the stars reflected him, not the other way around. This was the great illusion of power, to confuse control with cosmic order. And as the war turned against him, he began to read every shadow as omen, every rumor as sign. Inside the bunker-like offices, lights burned late into the night. Astrologers, occultists, and psychics rotated through the corridors, their words wrapped in secrecy. Documents were stamped top secret, but what they contained were prophecies, calendars marked with lucky days and dangerous alignments. Whispered voices in the background, fading in and out, indistinct German phrases, rustle of papers. The men who had once built their empire on science and precision now turned to symbols, hoping for rescue from within their own myths. The rational world had become unbearable, the mystical world, irresistible. Some say that by the final years of the war, Hitler believed he was protected by unseen forces, that as long as certain signs aligned, he could not fall. Others suggest that, in his heart, he knew it was all an illusion. But found comfort in pretending otherwise. It's hard to know which is more tragic, faith that blinds, or disbelief that clings to faith out of fear. Ticking stops. Silence. Then the faint sound of deep breathing, slow, uneven. In the last months, when decisions grew desperate, even the smallest details were infused with superstition. The placement of furniture, the direction of doors, the timing of speeches, all shaped by omens and warnings. The empire that once promised rational order had dissolved into ritual and chance. A soft exhale. The sound of pen dropping. The stars, of course, remained unmoved, ancient, patient, watching. They had seen countless empires fall beneath their light, countless men mistaking the sky's indifference for destiny. Pause, soft wind passes through, as if through a broken window. And so, in those final years, reason itself began to fade from the room. Like the ticking of a clock that keeps running even after no one is listening. Long silence. Because when power begins to dream, it stops hearing the waking world. By the spring of 1945, Berlin was no longer a city, it was an echo. Streets lay buried beneath smoke and stone. The air trembled with the sound of collapsing buildings and unanswered prayers. And deep beneath it all, under the choking weight of earth and iron, the last empire of myth had retreated into its own shadow. The Führerbunker. A maze of narrow corridors, sealed doors, and stale air. A place that smelled of damp concrete, tobacco, and waiting. Here, in these rooms without windows, time itself seemed to slow. The ticking of clocks blurred into the rumble of distant explosions. Maps curled at the edges from the damp, their red lines fading into smudges. Outside, the Soviet artillery crept closer, a drumbeat marking the end. But inside, in the flickering light of candles and lamps, the rituals continued. A faint shuffle of papers, someone whispers a date, then erases it. The great maps of Europe were gone now, replaced by astrological charts and calendars of omens. Generals marked positions of planets instead of troops. Each dawn, aides brought in reports not only of weather and supply lines, but of stars. A day of Mars in retrograde meant attack should wait. An eclipse warned of betrayal. Destiny, once declared inevitable, had been reduced to calculation, celestial, not strategic. Somewhere in the dim corner of that bunker, an officer muttered a line he'd heard from Himmler. "Perhaps the stars still favor us." No one answered. The sentence hung in the air like the smoke of an extinguished match, fragile, absurd, and unbearably sad. Soft creak of a chair. The scratching of a pencil on paper. Himmler himself was gone, his hopes scattered, his faith collapsing beneath the weight of reality. But the machinery of belief still turned. Superstition had become habit, a rhythm too old to stop. Each report that reached Hitler's desk was read and reread, not for fact, but for sign. Numbers were no longer numbers, they were omens, metaphors, messages from destiny itself. He spoke of miracles that would turn the tide, of hidden armies, of weapons yet unseen. He spoke softly, as if not to disturb the vision. And those who listened nodded, not out of belief, but out of mercy. In that underground twilight, disbelief had become dangerous, and silence, an act of kindness. Rumble of explosion. Dust falls from the ceiling. Then, stillness. Sometimes, in the long hours between bombardments, a record would play. Old marches, once triumphant, now hollow echoes against concrete. The melodies wavered, warped by the small gramophone speaker, their rhythm barely masking the tremor in the walls. In those moments, the bunker felt less like a command post and more like a mausoleum of dreams. Each corridor lined with ghosts of certainties long dead. Each map, each candle, each whispered prophecy, a relic of belief that refused to fade. Outside, the Red Army advanced street by street. Inside, a man who once imagined himself master of fate now lived by its illusions. He still spoke of destiny, still murmured that the stars had not abandoned him. He told his secretaries that the world would remember his struggle, that in some future age, his vision would rise again. And then, in a quieter voice, almost to himself. If only they had faith. Soft pause. The sound of a match being struck. A faint crackle of flame. Faith, it had built his empire, sustained his illusions, and now it lit the final candles in the darkness. The rituals went on. Reports delivered on schedule, salutes given, appointments kept. Even at the end, the machinery of order continued to hum, like a clock refusing to admit that its gears were broken. Faint ticking begins again, slow, irregular. Above them, the city burned. Below, the candles flickered. In the spaces between light and shadow, the last prayers were not to gods, but to memory. That somewhere, somehow, the myth had meant something. Long pause. A low breath, almost a sigh. And when the last shell struck, and the walls trembled, and the smoke filled the corridors, there were no stars left to consult. Only the silence that follows belief. And the faint echo of a man whispering to a universe that never answered. The ticking stops. The sound fades into a deep, heavy stillness. The war ended, as all wars do, not with revelation, but with exhaustion. The fires burned out, the voices fell silent, and the world awoke to a strange quiet it did not yet know how to bear. Across Europe, cities lay open like broken clocks, gears exposed, hands frozen mid-motion. And among the ruins, the victors began their slow descent into the remnants of what had once been a dream. One morning, in the soft grey light after surrender, a convoy of Allied soldiers approached the hills of Westphalia. They came not in search of battle, but of truth. At the top of the road, surrounded by mist and silence, stood Weilsburg Castle, its towers still sharp against the sky, its windows like closed eyes. Footsteps echo up stone stairs. The creak of an old door opening. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust floated in thin rays of sunlight, the scent of burned wood mingling with stone. The great hall, once echoing with chants and speeches, was empty now, only the flutter of a loose paper, the faint drip of water somewhere below. The symbols on the walls were cracked, their paint flaking. The runes had faded to ghosts of their own outlines. A chalice, half melted by fire, rested on the edge of a table like a relic of a lost religion. Down in the crypt, where the black sun still gleamed faintly beneath soot, the soldiers moved in silence. Their boots disturbed centuries of dust, each step echoing too loudly in the circular room. 12 pedestals surrounded the symbol, just as before, but the chairs were gone. Only impressions on the floor remained, like shadows of vanished devotion. One soldier reached down and brushed the dust from the carved lines of the sun. It was cold to the touch, lifeless, just stone. He stood there for a moment, perhaps wondering what it had all meant, what power these men had thought they could summon from geometry and faith. He saw no energy, no hidden force. Only the faint mark of human hands, and the quiet residue of belief. Soft exhale. The wind sighs through broken windows. Elsewhere, investigators gathered the records that survived, burned pages, photographs of rituals, diagrams of ancestry and stars. They tried to piece together the story, but much of it had already turned to ash. The myth had devoured its own evidence. What remained was both mundane and haunting. 1,000 signatures, 1,000 charts, and the realization that an empire had built itself on the scaffolding of imagination. And yet, even imagination leaves traces. The castle still stood. The runes still whispered faintly from the walls. The myth had not died. Only changed shape, retreating into rumor, legend, and the fascination of those who would come later, staring at its ruins in wonder and disbelief. Footsteps fade, a distant church bell rings once. For myths, unlike empires, are patient. They wait for new listeners, new interpreters, new dreamers who will brush away the dust and ask the same dangerous question: what if it was true? But in that moment, on that quiet day in 1945, there was no grandeur left, only the stillness after thunder, the hum of a world trying to remember how to breathe again. The soldiers left the castle as they found it, silent, wounded, half forgotten. Behind them, the wind moved through the halls like a sigh, as if the stones themselves were finally tired. Long pause. The sound of footsteps retreating. Wind carries through open doors. The symbols, the relics, the chants, all of it had promised eternity. Yet when the light returned, all that remained was dust, fingerprints, and the quiet truth that human belief, even at its most misguided, is only ever human. The wind fades. Only the faint ticking of a distant clock remains. And in that soft ticking, the world began again. And now, the echoes fade. The footsteps that once marched in certainty have fallen silent. The halls of Weilsburg stand empty, their stones cool again beneath the touch of time. The myths that once burned so fiercely have turned to smoke, drifting into the night. Maybe you are lying there, eyes closed, feeling the weight of the story settle around you like dust. You've walked through shadowed corridors, watched empires rise from symbols, and seen belief become a mirror for power. And yet here, in this quiet moment, all those centuries of noise have softened into stillness. Soft breath. A pause. The candle flickers. It's strange, isn't it, how easily the human heart turns toward mystery. Even now, after everything we've learned, after the sciences and the stars and the endless explanations, we still feel the pull of something larger. A need to believe that the unseen might still be listening. When reason sleeps, myth awakens. Not as an enemy, but as a reflection, a reminder that inside each of us, there is a longing for pattern, for story, for meaning beyond what can be measured. The men in those candlelit rooms did not begin as monsters. They began as dreamers, lonely souls reaching for order in chaos, for comfort in certainty. And though their dreams became delusions, their yearning was human. That, perhaps, is what makes this story so haunting, and so familiar. A slow, melodic hum begins, soft, like a lullaby on a single string. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine all the symbols, the rituals, the castles and relics, dissolving, one by one, into the night air. What remains is not power, but perspective. Not prophecy, but the quiet understanding that every age invents its own truths. And every truth eventually fades back into myth. Perhaps that is how history breathes. In and out, reason and reverence, faith and doubt. We rise, we dream, we fall, we learn, and we dream again. Soft wind through an unseen window. The candle flickers once more. Somewhere tonight, another story begins. Another search for light in the darkness. Another voice whispering that meaning lies just beyond what we can see. And so, as the candles fade, we remember. Not the power they sought, but the silence that followed.